We got our evening of torrential rain, and it's washed the Eskdale skies. There are long views to the mountains that we're going to be climbing today. Wainwright said that the silhouetted, serrated ridge running out to Green Crag could be as arresting as the black cooling of sky. With its constantly changing cloudscapes, it's probably one of the most photographed, if unidentified, views in Lakeland, but that's from cars that screech to a halt on the road across Burka Moor. Very few people abandon the car and go to see Green Crag at close quarters. I don't think we'll be seeing many coach parties in this stretch of remote Lakeland. The bare nuts and bolts of the day are that we're going to be doing about 3,800 feet of ascent, 30.5 miles or so from Boot to Bootle. But actually, it's going to be a day of folklore and fantastic landscapes. Apart from the fact that the first lift onto the hill brings us into this wonderful natural forest of juniper, we've come up from the River Esk, and these three West Cumbrian rivers, the Esk, the Urt and the Mite, have been prized since Roman times as a source of freshwater pearls. The natives would dredge for the freshwater mussels and sell the pearls to the Roman garrison at Ravenglass, which was being used as a forward supply base for Agricola's campaigns in the north. The pearls would be sent back to Rome, where they'd be used to adorn Roman ladies' hair, to decorate breastplates and goblets, to be crushed and taken as an aphrodisiac. From this remote place to the very heart of empire. From Low Burka in Eskdale, we set out on a peat road that zigzags onto the hill, at the edge of the sprawling mass of Harter Fell, with its dozens of mini summits. The last time I set off for Green Crag, the cloud came down. I ended up going to about 15 tops, just to be sure I'd actually made it to Green Crag. But no such problem today. Every yard of the journey offers shifting views of Eskdale and the promise of challenges ahead. And then there's the first little grunt of the day, picking a route onto Crook Crag. So few people come here, there's no clear path. We're just heading for what looks like a promising cleft on the side of the hill. Let's call it, for the sake of argument, Robson's Rake. If you've been walking with us before, you'll know that this is not one of those programmes where the bloke who's doing the walking comes up the hill with every hair in place and face lifted specially for the occasion. If I'm out of breath, I'm out of breath. And yes, I'm out of breath. It's the problem of trying to keep pace with a young, fit cameraman, you know. Well, at least it would be if we had a young, fit cameraman. Jess. Jess! Stop eating your leg. I'm still out of breath. Well, they may call this Crook Crag, but I promise that if you come up here, you won't feel cheated, because just look at this wonderful panorama. Behind us here, the great bulk of Harter Fell. Through in the far distance, lit above the Langdales, a little glimpse of Pike of Blisco. And now we're out onto the long ridge of Crinkle Crags. In the centre, its head completely shrouded in cloud, Bow Fell. Coming out of the cloud to the left of that, Esk Pike. And then we're onto the Scawfell range, Scawfell itself lit. Behind, the dark blob of Kirk Fell with its two summits. In the far, far distance, just a little glimpse of the High Stile range, and then the great black outline of Pillar, rising to the single summit of Black Crag, the double summit next of Red Pike. In the foreground of Red Pike, of course, is the great bulk of Whitbarrow, and to the left of Red Pike, the long sloping decline of Scote. And if you look further left still, you'll just see, in the far distance, Haycock, popping its head above the end of Ilgill Head. And then in the foreground, reflecting the sky, the little patch of water that's Eel Tarn. Come on, Doc. Over our shoulder, the sentinels of the Scawfell range, great walking and climbing. And from the plateau that we're exploring today, there are majestic views of them. AW reckoned that the views were actually better from here than from the higher, more popular Harter Fell. And of course there's the bonus that we have the majestic views to ourselves.
Here, Jess. Come on.
Go on, girl.
Come on. Come on. That's it.
Good.
On the Coxcomb ridge of Crook Crag, there's a danger of getting a crick in your neck from all those stolen glances back to the sunlit central fells. But then there's the drop-in to the boggy hollow that emphasises the towering promise of Green Crag. You could go straight up the front of Green Crag, but it's a dodgy climb over precariously balanced boulders. Better, safer, to do the extra few hundred yards, skirt the outcrops, and approach the summit from the back.
And when you get up here to the summit of Green Crag, you'll have climbed about 1,500 feet or so. You've given yourself space, so give yourself time as well. Don't be a scamper and a scurrier. Don't go around ticking off summits in your little book. Nothing AW would have hated more than a Wainwright bagger. So give yourself time to watch the changing weather, watch the changing light. You can get all 4 seasons in the same day up here at this time of year. So just think of your mates still at work in the office, relax and enjoy it. And when you've had enough of the atmosphere of Green Crag, just look out there and you'll see Devock Water. That's where we're going to be in a couple of hours' time. It's the halfway point on our circumnavigation of the Lake District. The feet and the pads seem to be holding up. I think we might just make it to the end.
Whether we make it to the end of the day dry is, of course, an entirely different matter. we're more or less guaranteed wet feet, because from Green Crag we have to negotiate the bogs of Burka. There's a temptation to crow fly to Devock Water, but unless you particularly fancy sinking up to your knees in sodden peat, I suggest you take the rather longer route that hugs the slightly higher and drier ground. You'll still end up with wet feet, but at least you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you tried not to. But anyway, once you've been caught in a sudden downpour on the way off the hill, wet feet just match the rest of you. And you're already working up the stories to tell your mates when you get home about how it was hell out there. Proper fell walking, not this limp-wristed height of summer stuff. Mind you, as it looks to be set in for the rest of the afternoon, and we've still got a fair hike ahead of us, those limp-wristed summer excursions suddenly become rather more appealing. But no, just think what a nuisance it is, constantly having to strip off layers of clothing because you're too hot, the suntan cream and all that palaver. Better wet and cold, he said unconvincingly.
Devock Water's a bleak and lonely place. It's probably the least visited stretch of water in the whole of the Lake District. It's the sort of spot where there really ought to be a drowned village, where you ought to be able to hear the tolling of the drowned village church bell beneath the waves in heavy weather. You can't, there isn't, but there ought to be. I'd have to imagine that bit. And yet once this was a much more bustling place, just over the western horizon, as the site of the Romano-British city of Barnska, a township with 300 or 400 souls. Well, today you'll have the place to yourself. Now I hear you cry, who else in their right senses would be out here in this weather? But if you're going to do a long distance walk like this, you've got to take the rough with the smooth. You can only get so wet. You've got your skin to turn the water, and I think I'm probably going to need it as I trudge the 5.5 miles over Yoke Castle and Whitfell.
And there's more rain and clag to come by the look of it. Heavy showers already sweeping along the Irish Sea coast. And that is where we're heading. It's about a mile of squelch to the 1,610 feet summit of Yoke Castle. And we find ourselves in a landscape more Pennine than Lakeland. Anyone who's done the Pennine Way Walk will recognise that the bogs here are almost in the same league. They just don't go on so far. Less than an hour takes us to rolling summits high above the cloud-filled Duddon Valley. When Wainwright was writing this section of his Veteran's Guide to the Outlying Fells, he noticed that it was possible to walk all the way from the Cumbrian coast to Crinkle Crags, across the summits skirted by the Duddon and the Esk, what he described as the perfect entrance to Lakeland. I think we'll save that for a better day. Our rather less challenging route takes us over Whitfell, to the best summit in this western range, yet another Buck Barrow, which AW reckoned to resemble in outline that star of Scotland's northwest mountains, Stack Polly. I think he must have had his rosy specs on that day. But don't get me wrong, the slippery bouldered top of Buck Barrow, almost 1,800 feet above the Duddon estuary, is well worth a visit. One of its delights is that after 11.5 miles and getting on for 4,000 feet of ascent, from here it's downhill all the way to Bootle. Assuming, of course, that we can find Bootle in the murk. And this is our objective for the day, a bruiser of a mountain, Black Combe. Welcome to remote Lakeland by the sea, and a mountain that most people recognise, but hardly anyone ever bothers to climb. So today, clear and cold, yesterday's mists and drizzles a fading memory, we're going to honour Lakeland's forgotten giant. Because it's stuck on the edge, most fell walkers planning their excursions ignore it. But Wainwright reckons that there's a good week's walking in these hills, so we shouldn't have much trouble filling our day, should we? We're following an ancient bridle way that for centuries carried livestock and trade between Bootle and the Witcham Valley. There were always low-level, longer routes round the mountain, but in an age before evolution and prosperity lost us the use of our legs, they thought nothing of a climb of 1,900 feet on their way to market or the Saturday dance in the next valley. I remember one old fell farmer in these parts who would cheerfully walk 8 or 10 miles on a sheep gather in all weathers, wearing wellies, trousers tied with string, and an ancient overcoat he'd bought from the Oxfam shop. He used to say that poverty had been good to him. It spared him from his worst excesses. He would have been good company on a walk like this. Wainwright would have approved.
It's said you used to be able to see 14 counties from the top of Black Combe. That was before local government reorganisation, of course, and Alfred Wainwright wouldn't have approved of local government reorganisation. Another thing he disapproved of up here was the fact that the Ordnance Survey added a foot to the height of Black Combe. It started off as 1,969 feet, and suddenly, arbitrarily, it became 1,970. But A.W. really loved this mountain. He once described it to me as being like a whale stranded on the Irish Sea coast. A whale that for most of the year generates its own cloud. He also described it as one of the few mountains in Lakeland that you can climb in carpet slippers. Well, today it will be carpet slippers and thermals because we're up here in a Force 8. But to me, the three really magical things about Black Combe are, first of all, its seascapes out over this way. Wonderful silvery seascapes looking out over Warning Island. Then there's the way that, very specially, these southern Lakeland fells ever so slowly reveal themselves as you're walking up the grassy slopes out of Bootle. And then finally, there's the fearsome Combe itself. It's about half a mile in that direction, and after I've had a cup of coffee, I'm going to try to battle my way across there without being blown into the next parish.
The poet Norman Nicholson lived in the shadow of Black Combe, knew its singular weather, wrote of the wind that scolds in from Sligo, ripping the calico grey from a pale sky. Well, it's certainly a ripping yarn today above the Black Combe screes. But we made it, and get a bit of shelter in the lee of Black Combe and White Combe and Stoopdale crags, as we start the long drop-in off Raven Crag to pastures above the valley of the Duddon. Above the river that finds its source in the cauldron of the Central Fells, in rivulets that sparkle in the rocks of Pike-o-Blisco in the Langdales. We've come down to Swinsard, its fields huddled under the hill, a place where for thousands of years people have sensed a mysterious power in the spirit of the mountain, have heard the voices of their gods in the whistling wind.
Well, that cleared the sinuses, didn't it? But then if you're going to do a walk that samples the delights of a Lakeland autumn, you've got to expect it to be a bit breezy. Now then, I don't want to overdose you on stone circles, but this one at Swinsard is a must. It's called Sunken Kirk, and folklore would have us believe that there was a church built on this site in the early Middle Ages, but the devil didn't like its positioning, and one night he dragged it underground. More recently, a wag on the internet has suggested that these aren't stones at all. What they are is clergymen fossilised for organising an insurance scam. But what makes this place so special is that 51 of the original 60 stones are still standing. Over there, at the entrance, even the portal stones are still there. This one, which is the biggest stone in the circle, and the second biggest over there, are aligned due north-south. Now, the remarkable thing about that is that there's another stone circle, almost identical to this one, in County Down. And the experts believe that this may just be evidence of a thriving trade in the Bronze Age across the Irish Sea.
We're heading for the little market town of Broughton-in-Furness, through the dripping woodlands of the Duddon Valley. William Wordsworth wrote of the banks of the River Duddon that they were remote from every taint of sordid industry. He must have had his eyes shut as he passed by Duddon Bridge, because here, in the woods, you find spectacular ruins that stand as a memorial to the labourers of a disappeared working community.
And this is where the Lakeland landscape meets the Industrial Revolution. In the 1730s, here on the banks of the River Duddon, they built this iron furnace to produce pig iron. For 130 years, it turned out 20 tons of pig iron a day, sent to places like Chepstow and Bristol to make ships' chains and anchors. But the really remarkable thing about this particular furnace is that it was fueled by charcoal. It took 10 acres of coppiced woodland a week to feed it, which meant that the place had to have 2,500 acres of coppiced woodland to keep it in regular supply. And so much of the tree-covered landscape we see today is not the result of landscape prettifiers. It's the legacy of an industrial powerhouse.
So who said it was a daft idea doing a walk like this in autumn? It's a mild and golden morning as we set off into the high ground above Broughton Mills, through a pattern of tiny farms clinging to the coattails of Lakeland. As we climb higher, a landscape that looks nothing very special on the map broadens and deepens into a spectacle of competing clustered fells. We're about 120 miles into our perambulation around the rim of Lakeland, and we've broken the back of the climbing without breaking ours. About 30,000 feet accomplished so far, 10,000 still to do. Quite a chunk of that today. But Stickle Pike, by way of Great Stickle, which is actually a great deal smaller, gets us into training for the exertions of the day. Now, Stickle Pike really isn't very big, just 1,231 feet, but it's a proper mountain for all that.
Come on, Jess.
It's rocky, with the ground abruptly dropping away from a shapely cairn. It fools you into thinking it's an altogether bigger chap. It has a sense of space and exposure about it, in rather the same way that Green Gable can be so much more exciting than its bigger, bulkier, but galumphing neighbour, Great Gable. What a morning.
Come here, girl. Here. Well, this is the first time I've been on Stickle Pike, but having read what the great man wrote about it, it's a visit I've been looking forward to. You know, he doesn't give praise easily, but this is what he says about this area. Go and sit down, Jess, for a minute. Go on, sit down. The Dunnerdale Fells are low in stature, small in extent, insignificant on the map, yet they assert themselves on the local landscape in a bristly defiance of accepted mountain standards. Of course, they're not worthy of comparison with Scafell or Great Gable, but they refuse to admit it. Where else in Lakeland is there so rugged a skyline? Where else outside Skye is there an array of peaks so crowded? The kingpin of this area is Stickle Pike, a mere 1,231 feet above the sea, yet a budding Matterhorn with many juvenile satellites. And there are no dragons on these tops. Good Lord, he was in poetic mood when he wrote this. No menace in their rocks. Instead, there are lovely tarns where asphodel and cotton grass and bog bean colour the shallow waters, adding gaiety to the scene and scenting the air. Lichened boulders bright with parsley fern, soft carpets of turf and bracken, innumerable pleasant couches where one can lie in comfort and think of real fells like Scafell and Great Gable. But do not voice these thoughts. Stickle Pike is proud and easily hurt. Now, wonderful piece of writing. And just look what you get for your money when you come up here. This is core. Beyond it, Dow Crag, that's the way our route's going to go today. And then we come round Greyfriars, Crinkle Crags, Bowfell, Eskpike in the foreground, Harter Fell, the Scafell's under cloud. Yesterday we had a bright and breezy day, didn't we, on Black Combe. Well, it's still got a little patch of cloud on it, but conditions are altogether better up there today. And the day before yesterday, of course, we were on Whitfell and Whitbarrow in the drizzle. Well, take a look at what they look like on a good day.
When we were on Melbreak, we were talking about the affinity that Wainwright felt between lakes and mountains. Well, I think that the affinity between tarns and the mountains that hold them in the rocky palm of their hand is even stronger. Gentle Stickle tarn, capturing, focusing the morning sky and releasing it as footlights to emphasize the star qualities of the crags above it. Next on the bill, in this theatre of mountains, rearing out of the Dunnerdale fells above Seathwaite, is the mighty Core. Core and the summits around it, Foxhaw and Brown Haw and Stainton Ground, have been deep quarried over the years for slate. But the quarrymen have long gone to the big splitting shed in the sky. Core itself is a fearsome chunk of rock. As A.W. put it, aggressively steep, an abrupt pyramid, the upper slopes concave and defended by innumerable outcrops of rock. But on this walk, it's just the warm-up man for our more famous top of the bill, which on a clear day, when you can see forever, ought to look like this. Teeth of rock gnawing at the sky. But this afternoon, the sky's biting back. On the long walk in from Core to Dow Crag, high above Goat's Water, the weather crept over our shoulder and wrapped us in swirling cloud. We're in a lonely netherworld of shrieking wind and mountain spirits in the mist.
What I'd like to have done about 45 minutes ago is to share the extensive views from the top of Dow Crag with you. Unfortunately, today extensive means about 10 feet. So what we're going to have to do is use our imagination. So go on, half close your eyes. And what can you see? On the way to the northeast, distant views of a spectacular Blencathra. To the northwest, Crinkle Crags, Bowfell and the Scawfell range. On the way to the southwest, out towards the sea, Black Combe. Okay, you can open your eyes now. See? It's amazing what you can do if you try. But what we miss in distant views here, we make up for in atmosphere. Because this to me is one of the most magical of Lakeland moments, when grey cloud merges with grey rock. Your valley becomes a sort of secret valley, a cocoon away from the cares and troubles of an annoying world. But if it all gets a bit claustrophobic for you, you can always turn your eyes to the sunlit lowlands, get the beckoning sparkles of Coniston and the thoughts of a bed in Torva for the night. Comforting, comfortable, 2 pillows, blankets not duvets, just grand. Just grand.
We're visiting what Wainwright called one of the most delectable lesser heights of Lakeland, Beacon Fell, guardian of Beacon Tarn, folded into the rambling hills above Coniston. And what a change from yesterday. In just a handful of miles, the country's softened from the splintered screes and riven boulders of Dow Crag to a land of gentle, undulating paths and drifts of myrtle and juniper and bracken. It's a place where A.W. in later life said he could recline in comfort and almost feel sorry for youngsters who at this moment are toiling up Great Gable. Almost, but not quite. I often got the impression that while he was exploring these outlying fells, in his mind's eye there were the constantly changing lantern slides of earlier young blood expeditions to the really high mountains. What he found here, though, complemented those vivid memories. Here on the remote rim of Lakeland, he found an abundance of constantly changing landscapes that inspired his pen and completed his Lakeland journey. We're by Rusland Pool, in one of the most tranquil valleys in Lakeland, mellow, autumnal, and yet joyful with the boundless freedoms of childhood. A.W. would call this a low-level rest and recuperation day. After all, it's only 17 miles of easy walking. And on the far horizon, you could have guaranteed it. Dow Crag, pin sharp, not a cloud in sight, and just a day too late. But fell walkers don't say, what if? They just know that one day there'll be a glorious window in the weather and the irresistible temptation to march back to Goat's Water.
Well, at the end of our day of gentle strolling, rest and recuperation, we've got a glorious evening. But the best I can offer you in the way of height as we approach the end of today's walk is the 630 feet of Bigland Barrow. When Wainwright came here to tick this place off as part of his guide to the outlying fells, he was bemoaning the aches and physical grumbles of old age. And so I'm going to end the day in Wainwright mood. I found myself a soft little patch of turf and heather. I'm going to make myself comfortable. I'm going to look out to the blue remembered hills, and I'm going to be thinking of younger, more energetic days in the high fells. Gosh, was that only yesterday?
Now it's a really easy day today, just 15 and a bit miles and less than 700 feet of ascent, which will take us to the plateau above the limestone escarpment of Whitbarrow Scar, high above the Lythe and Winster valleys. Wainwright wrote that this was the most beautiful walk in the whole of his exploration of the outlying fells. Scenery that has no blemish, as he put it. It begins as a woodland stroll, along graded paths laid across the face of the escarpment where Victorian gentlefolk in their finery would have come to study the natural world and marvel at the views from the summit.
You know, it's only a matter of 400 or 500 years since, during high tides and in heavy weather, the sea would roll in out of Morecambe Bay and partially inundate the Winster and Lythe valleys, turning them into a sort of South Cumbrian fjord, I suppose. Heavy seas would crash against the bottom of the limestone cliffs of White Scar and Whitbarrow Scar. And then, well, a couple of hundred years ago, there was agricultural improvement, enclosure, and above all, drainage. The land was won back from the sea, where once there had been wind-whipped salt spray, there was a sea of billowing damson blossom. The Lythe Valley became the damson capital of Britain. It's a lovely place, but for the really good views, we have to go a bit higher still. Oh, yeah.
We're no more than a mile from the South Lakes trunk road, but already we're in a world apart, above and beyond the revvings and scurryings. We've walked into a different dimension, through an invisible doorway in space and time.
It's a rare, bleak, but surprisingly delicate place, this plateau above the Scars. It's a triple SI, it's a nature reserve, and today it's giving us the best views for years, because as part of the nature reserve management plan, they've been cutting down some plantations of Corsican pine, which got in the way of the views away to the east. But look what we can see here. Over here, under cloud, the great rounded black mass of Cordale Moor. Come left a bit of that, and there's the plunge in, that's the red screes going down to the Kirkston Pass. Then under cloud there'll be Fairfield and Dow Crag. You can just see, away in the far horizon there, a little lighter, that's the Skidder Range. Coming round again, a bit of dappled light on the front faces of Langdale Pikes. Typically in cloud, the great black mass of Bow Fell. Round here, the distinctive shape on the far horizon there of Coniston Old Man, Dow Crag to the left of it. And I think, just popping over that horizon there, I think that's probably Core, and a little to the left, Stickle Pike. And then over here, very misty today, the great whaleback on the far horizon of Black Combe. Then we tickle away through the Cartmel and Duddon fells, down to the sea. Over on the horizon there, the Heysham nuclear power station, which the architects of the British nuclear industry have managed to blend so satisfyingly into its surroundings, don't you think? Arnside Knot in the foreground here, surrounded by the water channel. In front of it is the railway viaduct. On the far horizon over there, there's a little nick on that far horizon, that's Clogher Pike. That's above Lancaster. Round this way, the very distinctive shape of Ingleborough. Over here, beautifully lit, one of Wainwright's favourite places, his herd of sleeping elephants, as he once memorably described them, the Howgill Fells. And in the foreground, what Sir Bernard Ingham used to describe as bog brushes in the sky, wind turbines. I just hate to think what A.W. would have said if he'd seen those blocking his view of the Howgills. Then we're heading north through the North Pennine Ranges, and then just catching the afternoon light, the Kentmere Range, beyond that the wilderness of the far eastern fells. Our task for tomorrow and the day after. But for tonight, all we have to manage is a stumble to Staveley.
We wake to an icing sugar morning. The wintry weather that's been threatening on and off ever since we were on Mardale Crags 11 days ago has finally come to the far eastern fells. But the brief storm in the night has sharpened the atmosphere and etched the summits in a crystallised landscape. And taking pride of place on that bright horizon, Harter Fell, its wall of crags, guardian of the passes between Long Sleddle and Kentmere and Mardale. We've ploughed our way up into the snow, through what Wainwright described as a broad wedge of lonely upland, over Staveley Head and Greenquarter Fells, Shipman Knots and Kentmere Pike. There isn't a footprint ahead of us.
Well, as we've got this glorious break in the weather, I decided to make a bit of a detour from our main route and come down to Smallwater on the Nan Beal Pass. Well, once these Lakeland mountain passes were thriving commercial thoroughfares, ringing to the sounds of pack trains and pedlars, the 18th century equivalent of Marks and Spencer, the double glazing salesman, and Boots the chemist, all rolled into one. All ghosts now. But those ghosts have left us a legacy. Generations of hoof and boot have worn safe paths off the mountain. Now, you know how enamoured I am of the Nan estate. The last thing we want is that fearsome harridan let loose in the hills. So before some smart bureaucrat decides that we all need statutory fell walkers insurance, we better sort ourselves out. And yes, you can feel a lecture coming on, because it is important to work ways off the mountain as it is to do the macho thing and plan your assault on the summits. And another legacy from those travellers' days. Here by Smallwater, they've left us these little stone huts where travellers could shelter if they're exhausted or if they were caught by turning weather. One word of advice though, if you're frightened of spiders, take your chances with the weather.
Harter is a noble mountain, a place where grandeur rather than climbing takes the breath away. I remember coming onto the rise to Nan Beal with Wainwright when he was a very old man. He stood for a full 30 minutes in complete silence, re-establishing his long friendship with the place. He could no longer make it to the top of the pass. He couldn't revisit the views away to the shimmer of the Kent estuary or north over Haweswater. But he described them to me in a detail as meticulous as his mountain drawings. Every rocky outcrop, every twist and turn in the path, every place to stop and raise your eyes to distant horizons for the best composition of view. He lived and breathed the place in memory. He could just as easily be here on the hill, picking his path through the snow.
I've always thought it must be a rotten job being a fence post, you know. Even when you retire, they pile you into a heap, throw stones over you and turn you into a cairn and still leave you out in the wind. Mind you, these ones here are having a retirement with a view. Look out over here. Sunlight on Morecambe Bay, you might just catch a little fraction of light there on Windermere. And then we come round and this ridge in the middle distance here, Yoke dips in and up to Ilbel, and right away in the distance there, backlit Black Combe. Ilbel again dips in, coming up to Frosick. And filling the gap between those two, there's Coniston Old Man with snow on and Wetherlam. Now, where Wetherlam dips in, that's the Rhinos Pass. It's difficult to see in this light because they sort of merge into one. But just beyond Wetherlam, you might just see a little pimple on the horizon. And that's the top of the other Harter Fell. Harter here to Harter there, 15 miles. Just shows how small the Lake District really is. Then coming up out of Rhinos onto Crinkle Crags, Bowfell, Stickle Pike and the Scawfell range. In the middle distance, the Red Screes. And then coming along this closer ridge, it rises out to Thornthwaite Beacon. You might just see the beacon there. Thornthwaite Crag itself plunges away behind the beacon. In the background, beyond that, Fairfield, coming round the small summit there, Dollywagon Pike, and then we're out to the Helvellyn range. And then coming round again, the great rise out of High Street, and then this one here, the knobbly one with a bit of sunlight to the right of it, this is Kidsty Pike. And it's getting altogether too windy and too cold up here. I've shown you the view, I'm going down to lower ground. Come on, Jeff!
We're in a world of ghosts and memories. Henry Marshall, the librarian who helped Wainwright to publish the early pictorial guides, is buried down there in Kentmere. Wainwright himself is on haystacks. Generations of Lakeland shepherds that A.W. admired so much because of their knowledge of the land have been driven from the hill by economic miracles invented by politicians who, hearing the phrase Harter Fell, might ask, where and was he hurt? But at least the mountains endure. They haven't thought of a way of destroying them yet.
And this is a case of practicing what you preach. If there's a hoolie blowing on the top, get yourself off the mountain early. And I'd already worked out that this route down here would get me off if I was caught. But even though we've had to turn our back on the high mountains, for the day at least, there are still delights. This used to be the site of one of the most remote farming communities in the whole of the Lake District, the village of Mardale Green. Scattering of farmhouses, a little whitewashed pub, the village church with 4 yew trees 800 years old. And then in the 1930s, Manchester Corporation built a dam at the end of the valley, doubled, trebled the size of Haweswater, and in about 1936 they started to demolish the buildings. The bodies in the churchyard were exhumed and taken across to Shap to be reburied. Mind you, that was an echo of times past, because until 1729 Mardale didn't have a burial licence, and so the bodies were strapped to the back of pack horses and taken across this corpse road to Shap. We were talking earlier in the day about the ghosts of the pack horsemen on the Nanbeal Pass. Well, this is a place of real Lakeland ghosts. Ghosts of a community drowned.
And this is a stroll to the finish, across the broad tracts of the High Street range, across wild and undulating moorland that Wainwright used to say demonstrated a profound reluctance to depart from the high places of Lakeland, irresolute, halting often in wide plateau, throwing down natural barriers of deep-cut gills that intersect these haunting, far-flung expanses. By Low Cop and Weather Hill, we're making for Load Pot, the last of the 50 or so summits we visited during our 14-day excursion. It's easy walking, just the place to let the mind wander back to the horizons we've scanned to fit pieces of mountain into the Lakeland jigsaw. Everyone who does the walk will find their own highlights, their own solitary moments of exhilaration when they almost merge with the soaring landscape. For me, Grisdale Pike and the ridges to Whiteside provided that sort of moment. Mind you, we didn't so much merge as dissolve that day. The memory of yesterday's snows on Harter Fell has a special quality too. And then there was our day high above Crook Water. One step up and two back on the Melbrake screes. There was the radiant walk into Green Crag above Eskdale. Watching evening fall from Whitbarrow. And across Water, a place I never tire of visiting.
Yes.
The jagged, elemental ravines of the Wasdale Screes.
Sit down. Come on.
It may be in remote Lakeland, but it's world class.
Here, Jess. Sit.
And the award for the best small mountain in show has to go to the miniature Matterhorn of Stickle Pike. And then, with a spring in the step, a rucksack full of slightly damp clothes, and a collection of mind's eye images that will extend our 14-day adventure into years of recurring pleasure, we set off across the fells where the Romans built their mountain high road, towards Penrith and Journey's End.
Well, as Oswater was our first glimpse of real Lakeland at the start of our walk, I suppose it's only appropriate it should be the last, as we come full circle at the end of 14 days of solitary walking on the remote rim of the most varied fell walking landscape in Britain. When Alfred Wainwright wrote his guide to the outlying fells, he said that the walks were for old-timers. Well, we've come across one or two quite serious grunts along the way. The feet and the paws are holding up after 190 miles. Well, actually only 186 at this point, because we've still got 4 miles to toddle down to Penrith. I suppose if you take into account our little detours, we must have done 40,000 feet of ascent or so along the way. I don't want this to sound at all ponderous, but I've actually found this quite an inspirational walk, taking me to secret places in remote Lakeland that I've never visited before. In fact, I've liked it so much, I think I'll do the whole thing all over again. But if we do happen to meet on the fell, do remember that I'm particularly fond of salmon and cucumber sandwiches, and I take my coffee white, no sugar. Enjoy your walk, whenever you do it.